Hi, everybody. Today we are discussing what military spouses need to know when military life collides with family law. We will be breaking down military pay, retirement, healthcare, support, custody deployments, domestic violence resources, and many of the financial issues that can impact military families during separation and divorce. And especially if you're going through separation and divorce with a military spouse who is also a coercive controller, sometimes it can get confusing. So I'm here today, Tiffany Lesnick. I am a domestic violence attorney, and I am joined by Vanessa Puhak, who is also a family law attorney, but she also specializes in the area of military divorce, which is a very different type of law and a different type of practice than divorce itself. So, Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you being on the show today. Today, we're going to separate fact from fiction and really educate you on the distinctions in military law versus just family law in general. So, Vanessa, thank you for being here. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in practicing in the areas of family law and military law in particular?
Sure, of course. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. I have taught several continuing legal education courses, but I have never done a YouTube or a podcast. So I'm very excited to do this. I appreciate you.
Absolutely.
So I, just like Tiffany, I'm a family law attorney in North Carolina. I'm a board certified specialist in family law, and I practice at Sullivan and Hillshire Family Law. Part of the reason why I am very interested and became very interested in military family law is one, because I was a service member myself, and I am also divorced from a service member. And so that was kind of the catalyst into getting into this area of practice. And I have been with my firm for about 6 years now. Mark Sullivan, who is one of the partners here, wrote the military divorce handbook. So I have some great mentorship. I am in great hands, and I really like doing this stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for your service. What branch of the military were you in?
I was in the Army.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so if you want to learn more about Vanessa, you can find her. I put the link in the chat, and it's also on the screen at ncfamilylaw.com, and you can go directly to her page. She practices here in Wake County or Raleigh, North Carolina. Do you practice in other areas of North Carolina as well, Vanessa?
I do. Typically, most of my cases, I would say, are in Wake County. But as you can imagine, with the military community in North Carolina, Cumberland County is a big one, right? Fort Bragg. A lot of cases come out of Moore County as well. So I do travel, within the vicinity of Wake County. We also do, our firm model is that, of course, we have our own family law cases, but we also have what we call our consulting cases as well. And we do those across the country. So if an attorney calls me from California and says, hey, I have this military divorce, can you assist with certain things such as drafting pension division orders, things like that? As long as there is an attorney licensed in that jurisdiction, we can also assist with that as well.
Okay, that's great. That's great to know. So if you need help, if you need assistance, you're going through maybe a military divorce or separation yourself, it's very important. You tell me if you disagree, Vanessa, but I do think it's very important if you are going through separation or divorce and you are married to a service member to find an attorney who has some experience working with military law, because that is a different subset of family law. Would you agree?
I would agree with that. And I think most family law practitioners are, of course, well-versed in family law, but they don't really delve too much into military-specific family law. And so that's kind of when they call us. Same way that if I encounter an issue that I'm unfamiliar with, I'm calling somebody else.
Right, right. And so military law, just for the audience members that are out there, military law is federal law. So can we presume, and I don't know much about military law, so I'm very, very interested in learning a lot from you today, but because it's federal law, can we presume that the benefits and the information that we're going to be talking about today is pretty much the same structure across all of the United States?
That's a difficult question to answer. And
Okay.
I think it's difficult because a lot of the times you have the intersection of federal law with state law. And I always tell my clients that come in, especially from out of state, is that is one of the things that makes this area of practice really complex, is because you have certainly federal law governing certain types of benefits, certain types of pay, but then you also have laws on property division from each state that come in and apply.
Right.
Child support, right? Child support guidelines, child support laws from each state that also apply. So as a family law military practitioner, you have to be able to connect those two.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So important to seek some assistance in the state that you're in if you're going through separation. I recommend that regardless of whether you're in a relationship with a service member or not, but excellent advice. So let's get into, what is military compensation and how is military compensation different than civilian compensation? What should the audience be looking for when we're looking at income for the provider, maybe for a supporting spouse?
Sure. So I think the analysis is a little bit different whether you have somebody who is actively serving or in the reserves for that matter, or somebody who's retired from the military, right? So that's going to look a little bit different. On sort of the more active side, of course, you have your base compensation, which is what the service member gets as his base salary or her base salary. But then you have all these other different types of compensation, such as basic allowance for housing, BAS. Then you have some special pays as well, jump pay, hazardous duty pay, language pay, things like that on more of like the active side. On the retired side, we're typically looking at retired pay, so a pension. And a lot of the times as well, we're looking at VA disability as well.
Okay. And I want to break down the retirement and the pension a little bit later on. So let's talk about like active service members. So you mentioned housing allowance. Is that something that they receive? Is that an additional amount that they receive on their paycheck each month? Do they just get a house? Tell us how that works, the housing allowance.
Sure. It depends on the circumstances. So typically, if a service member is given government housing, then that is sort of their housing allowance, right? They're getting the quote unquote free housing, if you will. So you typically won't see a housing allowance most of the time if they're in government housing. If they're not in government housing, then they do get that allowance, which is based on geographic location, of course, because it costs different amounts of money to live in different parts of the country. And it's also based on rank and whether or not the service member has dependents.
Will that show? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're fine. And so the housing allowance, and what you want to get really, if you have a military case with somebody who's actively serving, one of the first things you ask for, again, if you're the attorney on the other side, is the leave and earnings statement, typically known as the LES. So that basic allowance for housing is going to show up on the LES. And if you don't see one, then that should typically be a clue that there is some government housing available.
Yeah, and I have a case right now that I'm doing with a service member, and I find the LES statement to be one of the best documents at uncovering all of those additional benefits and income. The pay stub itself is not the most helpful. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, the LES is what I like to call a treasure trove of information, because it helps you with, of course, figuring out income for purposes of child support, spousal support. And it also, and again, we're going to talk about the pension later, but it also helps us figure out some information that we need for the pension as well.
What would you say is the best document for if you have to obtain a document or request a document? What is one of the best documents to request or obtain as far as uncovering all of the benefits or all of the income that a service member would be earning?
You definitely want to get a copy of that LES.
Okay.
And depending on the circumstances, you might want to get some historical data on the LES as well. For example, if a service member is deployed, their pay can change, right? And you're not going to necessarily going to see that on the, June 2026 LES if he was deployed in January of 2026 kind of thing. So definitely start with an LES and then kind of go from there. And then you have your typical documents, right, that you see in a support case, such as tax returns, bank statements, things like that.
So we have a question from the audience. They would like to know, are there records beyond LES statements and W-2s that would help identify military compensation, special pays, bonuses, allowances, and deployment-related compensation or other income sources?
A lot of that is going to come in and show up on the LES. What I typically like to do in my cases, and this is not necessarily an income document per se, but what I typically like to do is ask for, I think they call them the soldier talent profiles nowadays, at least in the Army they do, because I was in the Army, so I'm focused on the Army. But I like to ask for the soldier talent profile because it tells me a lot of information about, for example, are they jump qualified? And are they going to get some money for that? Do they have a certain language proficiency level? And could they potentially get some money from that? Where have they been? Have they been deployed? Where have they been for their duty stations, things like that. So that's helpful to at least inform the circumstances to see if there's anything else that we need to look into. But the LES is typically going to have all of that pay information on there.
And where do we request this information? If we're a spouse, are we entitled? Like, are we able to go to a particular division, location, place and request an LES or additional income information and receive these documents without our spouse's consent?
I'm going to say the general answer to that is not really. The best way, or at least I think the way that I would start to attempt to get this information is through discovery, right? Through the discovery process, whether that's voluntary or not, right? But if that fails, we run into a couple of issues with regards to how to obtain that information, because of course, the agency, it's a federal agency that manages these types of pay. And so if you issue a subpoena to a federal agency from a state court, they're going to just turn it away. Another way, and this is more of, again, just gathering information as we go along the process. So a lot of this information is available, at least with regards to base pay, BAH, and BAS. So if you know the rank and years of service of the service member, you can typically figure out what that base pay is going to be by going to the Defense Finance and Accounting Service website, right? They publish that information. So it's not service member specific, but at least you'll have an idea of what that base income is going to be. Same thing with BAS. You can go online and find a calculator for, BAH, not BAS. BAS is the same for everybody. And find what that would be based on the zip code, the rank, and the number of dependents. So I haven't really had, in the years that I've been doing this, really a lot of trouble getting that information. At some point, especially if the case is in litigation, I'd rather go ask the judge to make him turn it over because it's easy for him to get than go through this whole other thing. But no, generally you can't just go somewhere and get that document.
Okay, and I did put the DFAS website up on the screen so y'all can copy that link, go to that website, and help you figure out like base pay. I recently tried to subpoena the LES statements from the DFAS and got a letter back that said you need to have an order from a federal judge. There was one other alternative that I had to get those records, but yeah, they're hard to get. You, as a civilian attorney, basically, you're not going to get them, and especially if you're representing yourself, I think it's going to be a challenge. So discovery is a great suggestion or a great tip for getting those documents. Please note, if you're out there watching, you can only issue discovery if there's an active lawsuit pending. So if you're in the midst of just negotiations outside of court, that might be a little bit challenging for you. But that is an option if you get to a point where you are in active litigation. So another question from the audience: if someone transitioned from active duty Army to the National Guard and later served in Special Forces, are there different record repositories or agencies that need to be contacted for those periods?
I think it depends what type of information you're trying to get. So if it's income information, again, typically governed by DFAS, right? But if you're trying to get some other different types of information, for example, and I'll give you an example of this. When I have a case where I have an active duty and reserve sort of mixed together and I'm trying to figure out the pension, well, I need to have what we call a reserve retirement point statement, which tells me reserve retirement is calculated based on this point system. And so I need a point statement. Well, that doesn't come from DFAS. That comes from the National Guard or the Reserve Unit or something like that. So again, I think it depends what kind of information it is that you're trying to get.
Okay. Is there a main, like, is you call it DFAS. It shows you how ignorant I am about military law. I was calling it DFAS. DFAS. Is that the primary source of information that you would go to as the first place?
I think it depends the information that you're trying to get. But for, again, income information, I think certainly that's where you want to start. And acronyms are going to be your friend in the military. So learn them, know them, love them.
Learn them, know them. You had mentioned BAH. So that's a housing allowance. That's allowance for housing. Yeah. And then there's BAS. Can you tell us about BAS?
Sure. That is basically an allowance for like food, if you will. Right.
Okay.
And that is, if I remember this correctly, I believe it's the same across the board. There's a amount for enlisted and then an amount for officers. The enlisted is a little bit higher. And I can't remember the exact amount, but it's something to the tune of like 450 or something like that for enlisted and something a little bit lower for officers. And that's a monthly allowance.
Okay. Are there other sources of what we call in the civilian world, we call like in-kind benefits or in-kind income that folks in the military are receiving that we should be considering as a form of their income for the purposes of calculating child support or alimony?
Again, depends on if you're looking at an active or retired service member. Active, again, you've got your basic BAH, BAS, and then you've got to look at your special duty pay. And then of course for the retired, you've got the pension and the VA disability as well. The other thing that I think we probably will talk about is the thrift savings plan, which is not necessarily a source of income, but it is available for certain purposes. But I'll leave that alone for now.
Okay. What does the audience need to be aware of as far as income tax returns and income tax attachments?
Sure. So a lot, well, maybe not a lot. And again, I think it depends on whether you have an active service member or a retiree. But I'm just going to use active, for example. You may look at a tax return and not get the full picture because some of these allowances are not taxed. For example, BAH is not taxed. Another example is if a service member is serving typically in a combat zone, their base pay, which is typically taxed otherwise, is not going to be taxed. So if you look at a tax return or a W-2 for that matter, right, which we typically get as part of the discovery process or the disclosures process, that's not going to tell the whole story. So you want to get the LES to figure out income. Do not rely solely on that tax return.
Okay. So there's certain military benefits that are not taxable, so they don't show up on an income tax return. They're
Correct.
not necessarily, they're not going to show up on the, they're not going to get like a W-2 or a 1099 or any other kind of form that's going to show that as income, because it's not income, right?
Right. It's not taxable income.
Or it's not taxable income to them, right? But it should still be considered income for the purposes of calculating child support and alimony and things of that nature. Would you agree with that?
In North Carolina, I would absolutely agree with that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
You got to go, of course, the definition of income in the guidelines is pretty broad. So I would certainly argue that those are included as income. They're certainly not excluded pursuant to the guidelines. I include them when I'm doing this. So yes, in North Carolina, I think they're included as income.
And then another question that we have from the audience: what documentation is most useful when alleging financial abuse or long-term economic control in military family law cases? Putting you on the spot.
No, that's fine. And the reason why I'm kind of like pondering the question is because it's so fact specific, right? It really does depend on the circumstances. I mean, obviously you have to start somewhere, right? But I really do think it depends on the circumstances, right? Is it going to be, is a bank statement going to tell the story? Obviously, we're going to need the LES for sure. Is the service member contributing to the thrift savings plan and the spouse doesn't know about it, right? The LES is going to tell that story. But again, I definitely think it depends on the circumstances of what that financial abuse could potentially look like.
Right. And I find definitely the LES is very helpful, but I also find bank statements are incredibly helpful. And the like Zelle or Venmo, however they might be receiving those payments, getting those Cash App, records to show how income is coming in or going out. And then I do like a reconciliation each month to show like, okay, this is how much income is coming in. Here's the inflow and here's the outflow. Do those two things mesh up? Right. And generally what I find with military income is they're going to be receiving a consistent amount each month, whether that's a disability or a pension or some other form of income. You're going to see the same amount of money coming in regularly, whether that's through some cash application or the bank account. So I usually look for those things. And one of the other things that we need to be mindful of is those deposits that are going into that bank account or whatever other form of financing they're using. That's the net, right? That's either after taxes or it's not taxable at all. So that's the full amount that they're receiving. So I ask the courts to consider, that full amount. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Vanessa.
I mean, I think it definitely depends on the circumstances. But I think the best piece of advice that I can give you all is educate yourself, right? Go to DFAS and find out what his base pay may be and kind of like have that idea in your head. So if you're coming up, and I'm just making this up, but if you're coming up with $10,000 a month and you're seeing $5,000 going into the account, well, clearly you have a problem there, right? You need to ask more questions. We need to do more discovery or whatever it may be.
Right. Okay. We've got more questions rolling in. Under what circumstances would a judge order either the military spouse to hand over the documents or the military authority themselves? So I'm guessing they mean like financial documents. And what facts would compel the judge to approve that?
Sure. So I think I'm going to focus more on the judge sort of compelling the service member to do it. And I say that because I think I'm not a judge, so I don't particularly in their head, but I think that's the most straightforward, most cost-effective way of making this happen, right? I think, of course, if there is, well, first of all, a lot of counties in North Carolina that I practice in have what we call these local rules that require litigants to turn this information over as sort of part of a financial case, whether it's child support or alimony or spousal support. So we definitely have that. And if I'm representing the spouse and the service member is not turning it over, I'm saying, Judge, like he's violated the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Make him turn this stuff over. And if he's not going to do that, sanction him essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the other sort of argument I think there is, because you need that information to figure out child support, right? Like you need income information to figure out child support. Like that's pretty straightforward, or alimony. But the other thing too about it is this isn't having the service member going to have to look under some rocks to get this information, right? They can get it with the click of a button in about 15 seconds. So why wouldn't a judge make him turn that information over, I think is the better question.
And I have a case right now. I have and discovery as well. You had mentioned discovery. If you issue discovery and they fail to provide, discovery is required, right? Once you issue it, then you're required to produce those documents, and you can file a motion to compel and ask the judge to order production of those documents. And I have a case right now with a military, a service member who says he can't go backwards and access LES statements from like 2 years ago. Do you find that credible?
Partially
Okay.
credible. So, and the LESs are typically access to what we call the MyPay system, just tied to DFAS, is connected to DFAS. And the MyPay system for the electronic ones usually goes back right around 2 years. However, the service member can then go to DFAS and say, I need a historical report of my LESs, and they will provide that.
Okay.
So again, it's partially true then. It's in there somewhere. I promise you that.
Okay, another question. In what ways could a veteran be receiving VA disability payments? And I'm not sure what this is, so you can help. First of all, the question asked about CRSC. So we can define what that is, first of all?
Sure. So, and this relates to retirement. So I will say that CRSC is combat-related special compensation, which is, well, I think it's helpful to first define VA disability. So VA disability is compensation that is given to the service member for what we call a service-connected disability. And a service-connected disability, of course, could be, the proverbial you got shot in combat, right? Okay. But it could also be you're walking down the street, going to the commissary, and you fall and you break your foot, right? That is service-connected as well. So it's pretty broad. CRSC is combat-related special compensation, which is a subset, I think, of disability. And that is a disability that results from direct combat, training for combat, working on instrumentalities of war, or anything that would have resulted in a Purple Heart. So a little bit narrower than VA disability. So I think it's helpful to sort of define VA and then CRSC. So what's the next question after that?
Okay, so can we just break that down for a minute? Because I have a question about that. So
Sure.
Are you able to receive VA disability in addition to the CRSC?
So, okay, I kind of have to break down retired pay a little bit more.
Okay, and this is why it's complicated.
Yes. So when a service member retires, receives retired pay, and also has a VA disability rating, which can go anywhere from 10% to 100%, and it goes up in increments of 10. If the service member receives a rating of 40% or lower, they're going to have to waive that retired pay, waive that VA disability against their retired pay. If they receive a rating of 50% or higher, they get what we call CRDP, or concurrent retirement and disability pay, which is really a fancy term for a restored waiver of retired pay. So typically they are not going to receive both. The service member has to choose between CURSIC and CRDP. So they're not going to receive both of those. And really, when that comes into play is how it's going to affect the amount that's divisible with the spouse as property with regards to the pension. When we're talking about income, again, I think in North Carolina, all of that counts as income for purposes of support, but it will have sometimes a disastrous effect on the pension as property division.
Okay. And so the question was, in what ways could a veteran be receiving VA disability payments or the CURSIC or CRCSC that could be hidden from their spouse if it's not showing up on bank statements or LES statements?
Yeah.
I think it would be on an LES though, would it not?
So again, we're in the retired world now, right? Okay. So the retired world is the LES goes away and now you get an RAS, which is the account statement. The retiree account statement will show his retired pay. And if there's a VA waiver, it will show the VA waiver as well. If there is CRDP, that concurrent pay, then it'll show it on the second page. So you got to ask for both pages. CURSIC, however, all you will see is a VA waiver for CURSIC. So there's a special CURSIC statement. So if you have a retiree, if you're dealing with a retiree, you want to ask for that RAS, the retiree account statement, and also the CURSIC statement.
Okay. Wow. Okay. It does get confusing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So since we're talking about retirement, what forms of retirement accounts are there in the military?
So there is, of course, the pension, right? And I think generally as practitioners, we're kind of, the world's phasing away a little bit from pensions, right? Not the military. The military very, very much alive. So you've got your pension, which is, of course, a monthly payment to the service member until he passes, right, for the rest of his life. And then we also have the thrift savings plan, which is separate and apart from the pension. So a service member can get a pension and have not contributed a penny to the thrift savings plan. And I will put a star for here. Don't come for me, because there is the military is moving sort of toward this blended retirement system, which does have a pension component and a TSP component. We're not seeing much of those because it is pretty new as it relates to, divorce and things like that. But anyways, going back to the thrift savings plan, the thrift savings plan is what we call a defined contribution plan, right? It is similar, or we treat it similarly for purposes of divorce as we would a 401k or something like that, right? We look at marital contributions. But again, it's separate and apart from the pension, is governed by a different entity. You will see, however, if the service member is contributing funds from the thrift savings plan, they're going to come out of his check, right? And so you'll see contributions on the LES. However, you do want to ask for a specific thrift savings plan account statement. In case there are some limited cases where you, for example, have a reservist who's serving the reserves, and they also have a federal employment position. Sometimes what you see is two different thrift savings planning, military one and a civilian one. So just if you have a case like that, just watch out for that. They're not, this doesn't happen every day, but they are out there. And sometimes I just get one thrift savings plan. But, there's sometimes often another one lurking, right?
What do you need to request for the pension? Just a pension statement, or do you recommend any particular documentation for the pension?
Yeah. So, well, I think it depends on what stage the service member is in, right? So if you have an active duty service member, and, I typically get these discovery requests that say, give me everything that relates to your pension. Well, if you are still actively serving, what does that mean, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, when I am trying to divide the pension and the service member is still actively serving, I want to see the LES. Because what we need to know in order to divide the pension is, what the marital share of the pension is, right? And so what I need to know is how long has a service member been serving during the marriage, right? And the LES will tell me that, what his rank is, things like that. But when the service member is actively serving, there is no pension statement, really, right? If you have a reservist, you do want to ask for that reserve retirement point statement or National Guard point statement. Because again, you're going to have to know certain information in there so that you can go ahead and divide the pension. If you have a retiree, you definitely want to ask for the retiree account statement, of course. We don't ask for the CURSIC statement. We talk about that. You also want to ask for the retirement orders because you want to know how the service member retired. Did they retire based on longevity, so rank and years of service, or did they retire based on disability? That is going to affect the divisibility of that pension.
Okay. Let's talk about, first of all, are there any other forms of retirement accounts that a service member can contribute to, or is the TSP pretty much the one?
As it relates to the military, it is the TSP. Of course, a service member can open up an IRA just like anybody else, right? But that's not really related to the military.
Okay. And is there a special court order, or what is required in order to divide? Actually, let me go back a question.
Yeah.
Are pensions and the TSP or the retirement accounts, generally speaking, going to be subject to being divided as marital property, state specific, but generally speaking,
Sure.
Are those accounts generally subject to being divided as marital property?
So in North Carolina, for the TSP, if there are marital contributions made to the account, so contributions during the marriage, then yes, typically those contributions are going to come in and can be considered marital property subject to division and equitable distribution. For the pension, so of course, and this is again that whole intersection between federal law and state law, and we have to go to our Bible, which is 10 U.S. Code section 1408. It's the Uniform Services Former Spouse Protection Act, which enables, it's a federal law, it enables the state courts in pension division. So it says, hey, courts, you are allowed to treat this money as divisible or marital property subject to division in your state, subject to your state laws, kinds of things. And of course, it has left and right limits, right, of what we can and cannot divide. But typically, yes, if there is marital service, then that is typically subject to equitable distribution.
Right. And you'll sometimes hear, I deal a lot with coercive controllers. And so you hear in the lay world, not just in military world, I earned it, it's mine, none of it belongs to you, I'm going to get 100% of it. And that just isn't necessarily the case. Right. So, and that kind of leads me to, I want to talk about all these rules that we hear about in the military. And the first one, I believe, is the 10-10 rule.
Yeah. So now we're in pension division territory.
Okay.
Right? We're dividing the pension as property. We're giving the spouse her share of the pension, right? Again, the 10-10 rule comes straight from 10 U.S. Code section 1408. And if I had $1 for every time I heard, we haven't been married for 10 years, she doesn't get any of my pension. Not correct. The 10-10 rule is not a rule of divisibility. It's just simply a rule as to whether or not the spouse can get her payments directly from the government. If the service member and the spouse haven't been married for 10 years, the service member has been serving for at least 10 years, and then there's an overlap of the two, that meets the 10-10 rule, means the spouse can get her payments. If they don't meet that rule, that doesn't mean the pension is not divisible. It just means the money has to come from somewhere else, whether it's a direct payment from the service member or some sort of, offset against other property or something like that.
Okay. So if they served in the military for 10 years and were married for 10 years during that same period of time, she would be entitled to get her portion of the pension payments directly from the government.
Correct.
Without having to go through him.
Right.
Okay.
And it's almost, it is a garnishment. I think I would call it a garnishment.
Okay. And is there anything else that applies to the 1010 rule, or is that basically how that works?
That's pretty straightforward. That's pretty much it. I know you either have it or you don't, right?
Okay. And what about is it the 2020 rule or the 2020 rule?
So it's a 2020 rule, and okay. That typically applies to, military benefits such as TRICARE, commissary privileges, and stuff like that. So if the service member served for 20 years, the service member and the spouse were married for at least 20 years, and then again, there's an overlap of those two, then the spouse, as a former spouse, right, this is after the divorce, will essentially become her own sponsor. She gets her own military ID as the former spouse, can get TRICARE, can get sort of, the access to the commissary and all that good stuff.
Okay. Does the 1010 rule, do both rules apply simultaneously? So if you meet the grounds for the 2020 rule, do you also then meet the grounds for the 1010 rule?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So they kind of do,
of course, right?
They layer on top of each other. And then there's also, is there a 2020? Tell us what the other rules are, because I know there's some other rules too. Sure. 2020-15?
The 2020-15 is, again, not quite TRICARE for life as you would get with the 2020, but it does entitle the spouse to a year of TRICARE, or the former spouse, I should say, because now we're in divorce territory, to TRICARE for 1 year post-divorce.
Okay. Okay, so that's more along the lines of health insurance benefits.
Yes.
Okay, so they're entitled to 1 year of benefits.
Post-divorce, yeah.
Post-divorce. What does a dependent spouse need to do to ensure that they receive those benefits? Like, what can they do to be proactive in receiving those benefits?
So typically, this is what I call, one of the easier areas, if you will, because the information is out there as to whether or not this person meets that rule or does not. This is not something that can be negotiated away, if you will, right? It's an entitlement and you get it if you meet the requirement, or you don't get it if you don't meet the requirement, kind of thing. But I think a lot of the language that I put in my agreements, if we're settling the case, if you will, is just to make sure that if there is something that the service member needs to do, that he will cooperate. But typically the spouse can do that, herself, as long as they meet that requirement. And go get their ID card and enroll in TRICARE and things like that without any help from the service member.
Is there someone in particular that they contact, or where do they go to ensure they're receiving those benefits?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the most important thing is to get that ID card, right? And I think I haven't gotten an ID card in a really long time. So I couldn't tell you. I do know that there is a portal that does ID cards. I just don't know if that applies, or if they have to go in person to, a military base or somewhere that would produce an ID card. Once they have the ID card, then they can just go ahead and enroll on their own, and then, access a military installation and things like that.
Okay. And you said it's an ID card, like you'd get at the DMV, just like an identification card?
Yeah, it's a military identification card, so a military ID card. And, most, well, I would say probably all spouses, well, they're a spouse, are going to have a dependent ID card. And of course, they're going to lose that on the divorce unless they meet that 2020 rule.
Okay. And then you just get that on the base?
Typically, yes. Again, I know there's some online system, but I don't really know how it applies, because, again, I don't really do that. So just, again, go to your local base and you'll be pointed in the right direction.
Okay. And Becky, I see your questions. I'm going to ask them, I promise. Are there like in-person resources? So if you're married to someone who's active duty, and you're going through an abusive relationship or you're struggling financially, is there a point person or a support person or someone who you can actually go to seek assistance, like a higher authority or someone who is in a position to help you if you are a military or dependent spouse?
Sure. So, um, usually military one source, right, is the first place that a spouse should go. And then I think if there is sort of domestic violence, the military has, of course, the family advocacy program, that I think have found just in the cases that I've had where there was military and domestic violence, certainly incredibly helpful for folks that are involved in domestic violence situations.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to put that in the chat, for everybody, just in case that's an issue as well. Are there any forms of income? So whether that's pension, that's income in particular for disability. So let's say you've had combat related disability or disability relate. Obviously, disability, I guess, is going to be from an injury that is not subject. Like you can't use it as income, right? It can't be divided in property distribution, or we can't use it as income for support purposes. It's kind of hands off. It belongs to the service member exclusively as compensation for their injuries.
So I would say that generally speaking, for purposes of child support and alimony, all of that is income, right? Whether it's retired pay, whether it's VA disability, it's income and it counts when we're calculating child support or alimony.
Okay.
Pension division is an entirely different story as property. Right now we're in the equitable distribution property division side. That's where the Uniform Services Former Spouse Protection Act comes in. And if you read it, if you are bored enough to read this law, it actually defines what is divisible, and it has a term of art. It's disposable retired pay. Disposable retired pay is gross retired pay minus any statutorily authorized deductions. Your authorized deductions are going to be your VA waiver, which of course, like we talked about, applies whether it's 40% or below VA disability or whether the service member is receiving CURSAC. Any funds received as a result of a Chapter 61 retirement. A Chapter 61 retirement is a retirement based on disability rather than longevity. And it's different than VA disability. Somebody can retire based on longevity and receive VA disability over here. A medical retirement is when the military says your disability sort of disqualifies you from continuing to serve, and so we're going to retire you based on that. And what happens then is DFAS gets the retirement packet and they calculate retired pay based on a percentage of disability. They also calculate it based on longevity, rank, and years of service, and then they'll pay the service member the higher of the two. If the higher of the two is military disability, then that amount is not divisible with the spouse's property. And so it can wipe out essentially the entire pension.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Those are the two bigger ones, right? Is the waivers, the CURSAC and VA waiver, and of course a medical retirement. And while I generally disagree with the service member when they say, I worked for it, you don't get a dime of it, I generally disagree with that, except for when it's a military medical disability retired pay.
Okay.
Because that could wipe out the entire pension, or wipe out the entire divisible pension.
Okay. Okay. So again, really important especially if you've been in a long marriage, to seek some counsel. Even if you can't afford an attorney long term, at least get in for initial consultation with someone who knows something about military law and family law in your area to get some information about what you may or may not be entitled to. What about if you've been married for less than 10 years and he served for less than 10 years? So maybe you do your 4-year term and then they're out. Any benefits?
Well, if they're out, okay, so the question is that now they're out, or is we're getting divorced and he's continuing to serve, is the pension divisible?
Well, let's talk about both. So let's say he served in the military for 4 years and, did his time and he's out. Any benefits that anyone should know about that they may still be entitled to, or no?
So typically the answer in property division is no. Generally, again, it depends on how. So I have a case right now, and this is why I'm using this as an example. I have a client who was involved in a very serious accident in the military and ended up severely disabled. And so this person does get a good amount of VA disability, and even, the base VA disability, and on top of that gets some special compensation as well. Those funds, again, not divisible as property, right? Can't touch them on property division, but certainly, right, there's a question as to whether or not they count as income. And I think the initial reaction is it is income, but then, the next question is how much of that is actually being used for that disability. So generally, I think the answer is no, but definitely you have sometimes those outlier cases where you really have to delve deeper into.
Okay. And ladies, just for your information, when we're looking at assets and we're looking at income, we always have to analyze it by, okay, there's two things we've got to look at. We've got to look at, one, income for the purposes of support calculations, right? And then there are assets that we're looking at for the purposes of dividing those assets in like an equitable distribution, marital distribution. So there's two different things attorneys should be looking at, not just the income, but like the asset distribution as well. What about like less than 10 years? So he's still in the military, but hasn't been in to meet the 10-10 rule. Any benefits or anything folks need to be aware of as far as what they might be entitled to as far as additional benefits go following a separation?
So definitely the pension, there is going to be probably a marital component to the pension. It's just a question of how are we going to address it once, that pension comes to fruition, if you will. Is it going to be a direct payment from the service member? Is it going to be an offset, right? Against, is she going to get the house and he keeps his pension kind of thing, even though he would have gotten half the house, that kind of thing. But I did want to mention here real quick, children, right? While the spouse may lose her benefits, may lose TRICARE, access and all that good stuff, the children will continue to be able to be eligible for coverage.
How long does the coverage continue for the children?
Sure. So the first sort of threshold is 18 years old. However, if they're enrolled in an accredited 4-year program for secondary education, then can continue to be covered under TRICARE. And then up until age 26, there's TRICARE young adults as well.
Oh, okay. How long does that go on for?
Just until age 26.
Oh, age 26. Okay. Which is kind of the insurance, rule for private or regular insurance covering your dependents. Okay. That makes sense. And then I had one more question, and then we'll get to some of these questions in the chat to kind of wrap it up because we're almost out of time. This flew by. Wage garnishment. Yeah. So if he has a child support obligation or an alimony obligation, are you able to garnish his wages through the military?
It depends what wages we're talking about. Okay. Typically, for an active service or even a reservist, again, those base wages, BAH, things like that, those are garnishable, right? With your typical income withholding order. Retired pay also can be garnished. The real sort of trick is VA disability. So VA disability, unless it's waived against retired pay, cannot be garnished. So VA disability standing alone is not garnishable. Everything else typically is.
Okay, so disability is not garnishable. Everything else is. What do you just need your typical wage garnishment form that you would get through your local court system, or is there a special military or federal form that has to be completed?
So for again, not retired yet, typically your income withholding order has to be served on the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, or DFAS. When you have a retiree or retired pay, we're talking about DD Form 2293, which is your application for those payments, and it applies to spousal support, child support, or property division. It's the same form for all three for those garnishments.
You said that was DD-2293.
293 is Department of Defense Form 2293.
Okay, I'll put that in the chat too for folks to grab that if they want. Okay, so we'll try to get a few more questions in here before we have to wrap up. Okay, so next question is, when does TRICARE typically end during a divorce? And you might have covered this already, and what should I be planning for now?
Sure. So assuming you don't meet those 2020, 2015 rules, TRICARE will end at midnight on the date your judgment for absolute divorce is signed.
Okay. So, is there anything you can do to extend your benefits? Kind of like, I'm trying to think of the name of the COBRA, like through private insurance.
Yeah. So with regards to TRICARE, you're not going to be able to extend TRICARE necessarily if you don't meet those rules. Now, the spouse is going to be covered in that period of separation, right? Because again, North Carolina, you have to be separated for a year. So the military still considers that a spouse, right? Ends upon the entry of a judgment for absolute divorce. With regards to continuing, it's the continuing some type of coverage similar to COBRA. If the spouse does not have to her available any employer sponsored, medical coverage that, most employers may give to their employees, then they can apply for a continued healthcare benefits program, CHCBP. But again, there is most certainly a premium associated with that. It's not TRICARE, but they can get that at least as a placeholder until they're able to get something.
What's the difference between TRICARE and CHAMP VA?
So TRICARE typically is, again, given to a spouse, right? Like when they're married for purposes of this conversation, and of course active and retirees, they'll get TRICARE. CHAMP VA is, as it relates to VA disability, and again, same thing. Spouses usually get it. Former spouses is a little bit trickier there.
Okay. So the CHAMP VA applies more in cases of service members who are disabled?
Right.
Okay. All right. Another question, what's the best document to show what a spouse would fall on, which rule the spouse would fall under? Would that be a marriage certificate?
So, well, I think it depends, of course, what rule you're trying to show. Typically, of course, you're going to know, right, how long the parties have been married, right? You've got a marriage certificate or a certificate for absolute divorce that's going to define the marriage. That's typically not the issue. It's really figuring out how long the service was, right? LES is going to have what we call the pay entry base date. If you have a straight up active case, you've got your DD 214, that's going to show it as well. In a reserve case, your point statement is going to show those dates as well. So those three typically are very helpful in showing if you have that 10 years or 20 years for that matter of service.
Okay. And let's see. Next to last question. If marital funds and military compensation have been used to acquire property during the marriage, what records are most important to obtain in order to trace the source of those funds? Do you have a recommendation for that?
So, okay, that's a bit of a loaded question.
Do you have like a preferred go-to when you're in your equitable distribution cases? Like these are kind of like my gold standard. This is what I like to go to first and foremost because I find these records to be most helpful.
So I don't necessarily, and I don't think, if somebody's getting paid, they're on active duty and they're getting paid and they're using money to acquire something during the marriage, I think that's marital property. Again, at least in North Carolina. I think the better way to answer this question is to frame it in terms of VA disability, maybe, because those are separate funds, right? We start with the assumption, well, not really the assumption, the fact that VA disability, that is not divisible as property, right? And so what happens if VA disability is used to purchase something during the marriage? Does that piece of property now become marital, or does it become separate, right? Or is it still separate? Does you kind of follow that trail, if you will? So I think definitely depends on the circumstances of the case and what piece of property we are talking about, right? And I think one of the typical examples that we see is, what happens if you have a joint bank account, right? And your VA disability payments are going into the bank account, but so is the spouse's income. He's working and you've got income going in, and you're, operating out of that account, buying your cars and boats and whatever, right? Like that, the more difficult it becomes to trace, I think the better the argument it is that piece of property is probably marital property. Mm-hmm. So I really think it depends on the circumstances for sure. But obviously, if a purchase, right? If you're talking about real estate, like how was it purchased? That's important. If you're talking bank account statements, of course, you want to go back to those bank account statements. If the service member is funding, let's say an IRA, for example, right? Like you want to look at that as well. But I really think it depends on what piece of property we're talking about.
Right. Okay. So last question, Vanessa, I'll give you kind of the final word. Sure. For every military spouse watching today, could only remember one thing from today, what would you want that takeaway to be? And I know that's a loaded question.
Sure. There are a lot of takeaways, but I think I have two. One is educate yourself as much as you can, right? There is a lot out there that you can read. A great resource, and forgive me for this because they just changed this website. So I don't know what's going on with the state bar right now. But the North Carolina Legal Assistance for Military Personnel, NC-LAMP, has a lot of information, a lot of articles that are really helpful when a military spouse is going through a divorce. Again, I think they just changed that website, but you can, I think, Google it and at least land there somewhere and get all of those articles and information. So definitely educate yourself as much as you can. But the other one is get somebody in your corner who really understands this stuff, because we didn't really get really deep into the weeds of things here today, but it can get real complex. And at least personally, my area of practice, sometimes I get the cases too late and there's not much that we can do. And I think the time to address it is, when you're drafting your settlement agreement, right? Or when you're at mediation, those kinds of things. It's not, later on down the road that you figured out that, oops, none of this is visible kind of thing, right? So get someone in your corner who understands this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really important to always be proactive versus reactive. We want to avoid, additional messes and additional expenses right from the beginning versus trying to have to come back in and fix things. That's where things get expensive and stressful. Right. So I want to thank everyone who participated in our Q&A today. We've gone over a little bit, and I want to be respectful and mindful of our guests' time today. So just remember, I thought your final points were fantastic, Vanessa, because knowledge is power. I say that all the time, right? And preparation matters. It is so important to being successful in your case. The goal of today's discussion was not to provide legal advice, but to help you understand the questions you should be asking in the information you should be gathering, because military law is complicated. If this webcast helped you, please share it with another military spouse who may need this information. Vanessa, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. This was a wealth of information. I have to be honest and tell you, I still don't understand some of it.
Well, maybe we'll do a part 2.
I know, part 2. It is so complicated, but I was seeing comments about how helpful it was. There was so much great information. So thank you for sharing that information with others. I know it'll be a beacon of hope for so many people out there.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this.
Yeah. And Becky says, would love to see this guest on again. So helpful. Thank you.
So Becky, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So thank you, Vanessa, very much. And thank you for everyone for joining us. Remember to like us, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and make sure to share this video with another woman who needs to hear it. We appreciate y'all, and we will see you next time. We do a live Q&A the third Thursday of every month right here on YouTube at noon Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you next time.